Sorry for the brief hiatus. I know it has been a minute, but I am back to go through all of my adventures at this year's Mohican 100 miler. Cheers, y'all. How's it going? As I mentioned in the intro, apologies for the hiatus, lack of videos, but I have basically been in recovery mode for the last 10 or so days, but wanted to come back with my recap of our adventures at the Mohican 100 miler. This is just gonna be a run through of everything, just me talking through the race. If you are interested in that, I also have plenty of footage to share from the race itself. That'll come a little bit later. Haven't been able to bring myself to go through all that footage, start putting it together, but I will try to have that out as quickly as possible. We are now like 10 or 11 days removed from the race itself. Feeling pretty good, obviously. Still have a little bit of just the lingering fatigue in my legs. That's to be expected in like the major muscle groups, like going upstairs, still a little bit harder than I remember before the race. But just like I said, the muscles are still just a little bit fatigued, nothing too crazy. The biggest issue I've actually been having, didn't experience this at all during the race, this pain, but the morning after when I woke up, even moving around in the morning after was still pretty good, was up and moving around trying to loosen up the muscles, but went on a short walk about midway through the day, again, just to try to get my legs moving, try to loosen up those muscles on Sunday. And I had this pain in the outside of my right foot that midway through the walk presented itself and then just continued to get worse and worse and worse throughout that walk, and then much worse throughout the day as well. Could hardly put any weight on the foot, was limping pretty significantly, was basically just walking on the toes of my right foot to avoid putting any pressure on the outside of my foot. Definitely concerning when you have that kind of pain that's not muscular. Wasn't quite sure what it was. I am happy to say I did just decide right away to go see an orthopedist just to get it x-rayed. Initial fear was like, is this a stress fracture? Could it possibly be something that might present more long-term issues? So luckily, no broken bones or anything. Unluckily, I guess there's this bone. It's an accessory bone that 1 in 5 people have in their feet. It's a tiny, tiny little bone that just floats right on the outside of you, like midway through your foot, right on the outside. It's floating embedded within a tendon. Doesn't serve any purpose, it just sits there, but after overuse or after a lot of stress, the bone can really inflame that tendon. So that was the orthopedist's guess at what's happening. So I've just been resting that, icing it a lot. Haven't tried to do any kind of like much rehab, didn't want to roll it out or anything like that, was worried about just inflaming it more. I've started to do just some loose kind of foot strengthening exercises, as well as just working to kind of stretch out the muscles around that area to hopefully alleviate some of the inflammation in that spot. Seems to be working. Went on my first run this morning since Mohican. So like I said, we are 11 days out from the race now. Just a quick 3 miler, felt very good. So was happy about that. Foot is still sore, but doesn't appear to have been made worse by the running. So I'm gonna keep testing the waters. I actually have a 10K this weekend that I'll be pacing a friend in, and just looking forward to getting back to running, rebuilding that base and getting ready for whatever comes next. To clear things up right before we dive into the video, I will just show off that I do not have a belt buckle to display. If you followed along on Strava or on my Instagram, you know a little bit more about what happened, but I have once again returned with the Mohican Trail 50+ mile run because we completed more than 50 miles, more than 2 loops, which I will get into. But if you want to take a guess now in the comments, no cheating if you did follow along on Instagram or have already seen the Strava, but put it down in the comments below. How far do you think we made it this year? We made it 2 full loops last year, called it at the end of the 2nd loop. So let me know how far you think we made it this year. And while you're doing that, I hope you will go ahead and give the video a thumbs up to help other folks find it. And also subscribe if you don't already so that you can see future videos from the channel. But all of that being said, let us dive into the full recap of my Mohican adventure. Starting with just the weekend overall, really went off without a hitch. Everything leading up to the race went pretty perfectly. Pretty easy drive, stopped several times just to make sure I was eating plenty, hydrating plenty. And arriving at Mohican, I gotta give a shout out to my partner in crime, Todd, who I run all of these races with. He really went all out on the cabin booking for our weekend. That was part of how he convinced me to once again sign up for this race, by sending me the confirmation before we had made the decision, saying, well, now we have to go because we have the cabin booked. The amount of space that we had, sleeping in an actual bed, being able to lay out all of our running gear. Like, it was just so much more comfortable, removed a level of stress from the weekend, which was nice. And it also allowed us to host a lot of our other friends that were running the race as well. So I mentioned in the videos leading up to this race, Dan, Ultra Dad on YouTube, him and his brother Will were running the race, as well as our friend Tim from last year. So all of them were able to come over. We got to see them throughout the weekend. We hosted a pasta party for everyone on Friday night as well to carbo load and fuel up before the race and before heading over to that pre-race meeting. But just Friday was really spent trying to relax, trying to kind of get in the zone, talk with the other guys, figure out what their plans were for the race. Was everyone on the same page? What was everyone's strategies? Just had a lot of fun hanging out, seeing everyone, having this reunion after last year's race, being able to come together again for this year. Had a lot of fun, but then of course it was time to try to get an early-ish bedtime because it was an early wake-up call for that 5 a.m. start. If I'm not mistaken, I think both Todd and I woke up at 4 to start getting ready, give ourselves plenty of time. I was taping my feet before the race. That's something I do, especially for these much longer duration efforts, to try to intervene, prevent blisters early. So that takes a little bit of time. It is definitely a long, delicate process. So I wanted to give myself plenty of time to do that, to eat, to hydrate, etc. I mentioned the nerves the night before. They were even more significant in the morning. So much so that I was so concerned on like the little details, making sure I had all this stuff. We get all suited up, we're good to go. Okay, it's time to head to the starting line. Our whole group leaves the cabin, and I made it probably a good 20 or 30 yards before I was like, hey, I should do some lunges or just do some things to loosen up the muscles, to just like get my legs woken up before we get to the starting line. And I go to do the first lunge and realize I was still wearing flip-flops and had not put my actual trail shoes on. So just to give you a little peek into my mental state at that point, and was just kind of that 1,000-yard stare of focusing on what was coming up, so much so that I was not paying enough attention to what was going on in the moment. So I had to quick run back, put on the running shoes, make it to the starting line, where we were able to once again serendipitously meet up with all of the guys that we had run with last year. We hadn't made plans to meet up at the start or even run together. We kind of figured we would find each other along the trail and obviously want to share some miles, but weren't sure exactly where that would be. And just luckily, basically, as soon as we showed up to the start, ran into Dan and Will, got some photos beforehand, and then when we went to go actually line up to begin the run, ran into Tim right there. So once again, the boys were back in town, happy to be starting the race with our group and enjoy some early miles with them. Mine and Todd's goal going into this first loop was to really take it relatively easy, especially through the first 2 loops. We wanted to make sure we were conserving enough energy through the first 2 loops to be able to make it out on that 3rd loop at the very least. But we're planning to take it nice and easy, ease into the race at the start, while also taking advantage of the cooler temperatures while the sun was coming up. And then moving into the 2nd loop, we would probably expect to slow down even further, just because that would be the hottest points of the day. And then we would see what was to come during the 3rd and 4th loop. But planning to take it very, very easily through those first 2. I think on our brains, we settled on like a 7-hour first loop. We ran the first loop last year in just over 6 hours, an incredibly fast pace that ended up being our downfall. In those early miles, our kind of core group of guys spread out a lot for the early parts of that race. You're in the dark. You've just got the light of your headlamp kind of winding through a lot of uphill portions in that first section. So it's just kind of a trail of headlamps. And Todd and I fell back a little bit. The rest of the group pushed ahead as some runners got in between us. Legs felt good, obviously very, very early stages of the race, but wasn't pushing the pace too hard, wasn't having a hard time holding ourselves back, was just easing into a very comfortable pace. Everything was going very well. And through the first couple of sections, we very quickly reunited with the full group, with Dan, Will, and Tim, and ended up running basically the entire first loop together as one solid group. Again, we kind of spread out, sometimes leapfrog a little bit, but for the most part, finish that entire first loop as our core group. In terms of our mile by mile paces, I think we were averaging probably between like a 14 and a 16 minute mile running time depending on the elevation or the terrain during each individual section. Some miles a little bit faster. I think we had like some 12s and 13s in there as well, but probably averaging right between that 14 and 15 mile mark. And then of course, slightly slower when you add in the times that we spent at each aid station. But overall plan and pacing for that first loop went basically perfectly. I think we finished in almost exactly 7 hours. And again, the entire time just feeling very comfortable, finishing that loop, feeling like my legs were still incredibly fresh, not feeling nearly as spent as we did after the first loop of last year. So I was very, very excited about that. The only issues I really experienced on that first loop were nutrition related. I had sort of a mental plan of how often I wanted to take in salt, how often I wanted to take in solid food, etc. But pretty much immediately was just having so much harder of a time than I remember keeping track of the intervals at which I was supposed to take everything in. So I would eat something and then basically immediately forget what time it was when I took in that food. And so it was just having, throughout the run, I found myself looking at my watch, trying to remember, oh, how long ago did I take in that salt pill? How long ago did I eat that gel or eat that food, etc. And I think that caused me to fall behind a little bit in my calorie intake. I was feeling a little bit of that nausea creeping in by the end of the first loop. Wasn't having a hard time keeping anything down by any means. It was just kind of this low level sitting nausea that I think I talked about in some of the training leading up to this race that I just wanted to keep an eye on. But again, it was still early. It wasn't causing any issues. I just very clearly became aware of, hey, I need to put a lot more time and focus onto this aspect of the race going into the second loop. But other than that, everything on the first loop went great. It is a very beautiful loop, very scenic as the sun's coming up. It's a nice way to start the run. There's also a small section of the course that you only run during the first loop that kind of takes you down into this gully. They call it the Enchanted Forest because it's just kind of like this little gully valley with like thick greenery on all sides, some down trees you have to kind of navigate around. So it forces you to slow down, really take in your surroundings, take in the nature that you're going through. And then at the end, you get to climb up this root structure to sort of bring you out of the gully before you continue on the loop. So really pretty part of the course. Was happy we got to do that again this year and just had a great time overall as we came into camp to settle, regroup with our camp, and then get back out on the second loop. Now, I can't remember exactly how long we spent at camp between the first and second loop. Obviously, we spend a little bit more time than we did at most of the aid stations. But that being said, we grabbed what we needed, said hello to everyone at camp, had a nice time seeing family and kind of re-energizing since the last time we'd seen them was in the pre-dawn hours when everyone was pretty exhausted. Energy was high at this point, was feeling good, got some more food down, and started out on the second loop. Two things that I decided to do as we started the second loop, partially due to the heat, but also partially just due to wanting to be better, be more specific, be more detail oriented about tracking my nutrition. One thing I realized was everything I ate, I dedicated a pocket to just putting the trash in between aid stations. That way, at any point, if I couldn't remember what I had eaten during that leg, I could look in the trash and remember, okay, it's been an hour, so I should have eaten at least 2 things. Great, there's 2 pieces of trash in here. Again, just trying to simplify that process and make it easier to track if I lost track of anything throughout. The other decision I made was my plan was to basically take a salt pill or a salt chew every 30 minutes and also eat some kind of food, some kind of solid food gel, etc. every 30 minutes as well, but staggering those at 15-minute intervals. That made it very easy between aid stations to keep track of when I needed to take food in, when I needed to take salt in, etc., because it was at the 15-minute mark. So I would start a lap as soon as we left an aid station. I would relap my watch. At 15 minutes, I would take a salt tab. At 30, I would eat something. So any 15-minute interval, so 15 or 45, I would take a salt chew. If it was 30 minutes or on the hour, I would take some solid food in. So again, just made it so much easier to keep track and stay on top of nutrition, which made a huge difference just in terms of the nausea level went away basically completely during that second loop. Energy level was also much higher, and obviously taking in plenty of fluids as well to balance out the amount of salt that I was taking in. Also, as we started the second loop, I think if I'm remembering correctly, our group started at different points. People finished at their aid station at different intervals. I think Todd and I were probably the last to leave the aid station, but we were moving pretty well, and eventually we figured we would catch up to them on the course, which did in fact happen. But second course, again, feeling really good. feeling much better than we did last year just in terms of the freshness of the legs, especially through the first half of that second loop. Everything went pretty much the same, just taking it easy. Again, I mentioned our strategy here was to take it even easier than the first loop just because these were the mid-afternoon hours. I think we finished the first loop at around noon, and so expecting it to be very, very warm as the sun got it to the highest point in the sky. I was taking ice at every aid station to just keep ice on my neck to try to keep cool. That certainly helped a lot, again, with the nausea and just making sure that I was able to digest everything fully. Slowed down our paces a bit, especially on the uphill climbs, but still feeling very, very strong. As we started the second half of that second loop, that's when our group started to space out a little bit, because I think this is especially when throughout 100 milers, you're gonna go through a lot of different ups and downs. People are gonna feel very differently at different points on the course. And so we were much focused on running our own races as opposed to running together. We still got to share a lot of miles, which was great. But I remember, especially like as we would get into aid stations, some folks would want to go in, grab what they needed, get right back on the course. Some folks, myself and Todd included, would want to take a little bit more time at the aid stations. Sometimes we would leapfrog and catch up during the loops, but especially during those final, probably like 7 or 8 miles of that second loop started to space out much more significantly. But towards the end of that loop, Todd and I were just talking a lot about, because that's when the wheels fell off in last year's race, we were just talking about how much better we felt this year there, especially during the specific portions where it was very vivid in our minds. We were basically death marching at this point, just walking so slowly, so defeated through these sections of the course, and being able to run through them, still feeling very good. That was a great feeling. I think we ended up finishing that second loop, I want to say right around the 8-hour mark. So again, slowed down by an hour. Again, exactly part of our plan. Wanted to take a little bit more time here, conserve energy, conserve fluids, and hopefully not sweat as much, just take it easier during those hotter miles to guarantee that we would make it out on the third loop. So the finish of that loop went really well. It was also great that our crew came out to meet us on the course at the dam overlook, which isn't a specific aid station, but it's a spot where crew can come out, and they had some Powerade ices, like Powerade frozen popsicles. Those became a lifesaver throughout the course. They were just so refreshing. They went down easy. They were so delicious. It was just like anytime we saw them, everyone in our group was like, I need one of those. Do you have any more of those? They were such a lifesaver, especially as we got further into the race. But the rest of the second loop went off without a hitch. Like I said, made it in just under 8 hours, right around the 8-hour mark. And then once we got to the halfway point, we're planning to take a little bit longer at the aid station. I wanted to retape my feet just to make sure they were all set to go. That takes a significant amount of time. Also wanted to take in a lot more food. It was also at this point that I became aware that Todd was starting to have a lot more trouble getting any kind of calories in than he had been throughout the race. He had been drinking, I think Tailwind was what he was using, but Tailwind wasn't going down as easy, food wasn't going down as easy. He had mentioned some concerns towards the tail end of that loop, but when he came in, was much more open just about how over the last couple of hours, he had hardly been able to take in any kind of calories, any solid food, even fluids. Obviously a concern when we are coming into just over the halfway point of the race. But luckily we were heading into the evening. We were hopeful that, again, the cooler temperatures would make it a little bit easier on our bodies, easier to digest. When you're not working as hard to cool yourself, the body can devote some energy to some of those other functions. So spent some time there, myself retaping my feet, just getting in shape to head out for that second half. Todd spent a lot of time just taking in as much food as he could, getting in as many calories as he could before we started that third loop. But then eventually it was time. Similarly to the previous loop, all of the guys kind of went out separately. We thought we might catch up to them at some point as we went out, but leaving the camp to head out on that third loop, the sun was just starting to go down. And we were just, at least myself, energy was so high going into the evening, starting that third loop, knowing that we had at least made it further than we did the year before. Looking at our watch, also realizing that at this point we could just walk it in. We could walk at about, I think, like just over a 20-minute mile and still finish with plenty of time. And so that was very positive. Our plan going into the third loop was really just to kind of take it easy to start, again, digest a lot of the food that we had just eaten, take advantage of the downhills, move as well as we could, try to buy a little bit of time, again, making sure that starting the fourth loop, whatever shape we were in, we could just hike and still finish. The goal here was finishing, not breaking any records, not going for speed at any point, just doing what we could to conserve energy to make sure we were still able to move forward starting the fourth loop. Unfortunately, soon after starting the third loop, we did end up catching up to Will and Dan. Dan at that point had made the decision to call it. He was dropping from the race. I mentioned people were going through different bouts of issues they were having towards the end of the second loop. Dan in particular, I remember mentioning that he was going through some lower moments, although we didn't know how bad. And when we caught up to him and Will at this point had heard, it sounded like he was in very similar shape to Todd, was just having real issues with nausea, real issues with kind of just keeping stuff down, digesting the calories that he was putting in, was starting to get very dizzy, and especially just beginning the second half and also going into the overnight portion, ultimately made the decision that it wasn't in the cards this year and decided to call it. So it was nice getting to catch up with him one more time and see where he was at. And then we kind of moved forward with Will to take on some of the climbs and everything that were coming up. Although I will say we didn't stick with Will very long. Pretty quickly, Will mentioned just how good he was feeling, how fresh his legs were feeling, and how he really wanted to take advantage of that for as long as he could. So he kind of ran ahead. Todd and I mentioned our plan of just kind of doing what we could, conserving energy and just moving forward. So we bid farewell, saw him run ahead, and then we continued on our journey. And through that first section, I just can't overstate how excited I was, about our time prospects. Also just couldn't believe how good my legs were feeling. Obviously, there was some kind of low-level fatigue. I mean, we had just run 54 miles, but was still feeling really good, was still able to power through the uphills, was still running, still felt absolutely fine to run. No kind of soreness or stiffness that was altering my gait or preventing me from taking advantage of the more runnable sections of the course. And so was just keeping an eye on my watch. I mentioned that 20-minute mile was sort of our goal to maintain through the overnight portion. We were a little bit slower than that through the first section, which is to be expected. I think we were at like a 21-minute mile average, but that first section of the course is primarily an uphill climb. So I figured we could definitely more than make up for that as we continued on through the course. And then I think it was towards the tail end of that first section, Todd just mentioned again that still having a little bit of a hard time digesting certain foods. The tailwind was difficult. He was eating ramen and some other foods that they had brought into the aid stations that seemed to be sitting okay, but just wasn't having as easy of a time as, of course, we would have liked to be able to take in the calories necessary to maintain the effort. So we got into that first camp, kind of ate what we could, collected what we could. He was talking with his girlfriend, Abby. I kind of talked with my wife, Lauren, just to give them a status update of where we were at. Tried to get through the aid station relatively quickly because, again, we were trying to maintain a 20-minute mile pace at this point. We were just over that through the first section. And once you put aid station time into that as well, just wanted to make sure we were moving and just kept ourselves moving so that we wouldn't start to fall behind. And I figured going into this next section, it was a lot of downhill, a lot of flat ground. This is where we could make up some of that time. We could get closer to maybe like a 16 or 17-minute mile, again, taking advantage of the downhills, running the runnable portions, or even just power walking. You can get up to a decent pace. And so figured we would make up some of that time, get into the next section. But then I would say pretty immediately after we started that section, it became clear that that wasn't in the cards. I think I took the lead at the start and again was getting up to like a 17-minute pace, just sort of power walking as quickly as I could, powering up the uphills, etc. But would turn around and find Todd was a little bit further back. So I would wait for him, let him take the lead at one point. And again, he was just he would slow down, trying to take in food where he could, trying to get in more calories. I think he had probably developed a decent deficit at this point. So wanted to let him take the lead so we were running his pace or going at a pace he was most comfortable with, and I would be behind kind of just like pushing, encouraging us, just trying to keep the conversation going, distract him from the work or the discomfort he might be experiencing, and just trying to keep us moving. Again, goal A throughout the overnight, but really at this portion of the race was just keep moving forward at a pace that we can maintain. But that pace started to drop back 21, 22. I think we were hovering between like a 22 and a 23-minute mile. So some concerns started to raise for sure. Luckily, this was a relatively short section, but again, was hopeful that this would have been a more runnable section or one where we could make up time. So started to get nervous as we started to actually lose a little bit of time here. Luckily, we were seeing our crew at the next aid station. So we got in once again. Todd and I kind of went our separate ways to discuss with our partners what was going on, what we needed. I mentioned to Lauren, I thought Todd was in pretty rough shape. He was talking with Abby, trying to get food in, trying to get stuff down, especially ramen, because that had been sitting, but it wasn't too long before Todd's eyes kind of dropped, made a beeline for the woods. So went over, tried to get some ice to put on Todd's neck just to help with the nausea. Lots of things were coming up. So obviously the nutrients that he had been taking in weren't being absorbed. So had established quite a calorie deficit. So we kind of sat, we're trying to troubleshoot, work through some issues, and ultimately came up with the idea, like, let's try to get maybe some liquids in, some of those Powerade popsicles, something that might be a little bit easier to digest. If you can get in some calories, like, we can still walk, hope that we can pull you out of this pit, and then maybe make up some time on the back end once your energy is a little bit further up. So went back to the car to sort of regroup again, had told Lauren, was a little bit worried, especially because we were in the overnight. This would be the last time we would see our crew until we got to the end of the third loop again. There were some significant climbs in that portion coming up, some difficult terrain. I think the most difficult part of the course was in that second half, so was a little bit nervous about that, but wanted to see what we could do. So Todd goes to try to take in some popsicles. I'm talking with the crew about what our plan is, but ultimately wasn't able to get that to settle in his stomach either. And so when you can't take in food, can't take any liquids in or anything at all, just ultimately made the decision that it was not smart to continue for Todd. And I had already decided in my head that, again, wanted to finish this race together. So we did decide to call it quits at the Fire Tower aid station in the third loop. We're calling it 65 miles into the race. I think it was like at the 64.7 mile mark, but you take into account all the jogging you do back and forth to different things, the trail tax, etc. We are calling it 65 miles. So a great race. I'm still very excited with how the run went. I know I had mentioned, if you watched the live stream that I did with Dan, the Ultra Dad, before we started this course, that was his last question. If something were to happen to myself or to Todd, did I think the other one would continue on? And it was certainly a consideration, but I had mentioned, like, there were just so many details to consider. I talked a lot with my wife as we made the drive out, and I was just thinking it would really depend on where we were at in the course. Obviously, if I had to drop, I would want Todd to go on to finish. I'm sure he felt exactly the same way. But a massive part of me wanted to finish that race together. Obviously would love to have come home with the belt buckle, would love to have finished, but much more important than that, wanted to finish the race together. These races are something that we do together. Every ultra marathon I've done with him, all of these trail runs, etc. And was a realization I came to when I was doing, if you watch the training run I tried to do, when I went out for what was supposed to be my longest training run, tried to do something on the trails and immediately ran into issues. One of the realizations that I had was, I do certainly enjoy trail running. I like going out for a trail run. I think it can be very relaxing and very refreshing, but I much more enjoy those types of adventures when I'm sharing them with someone else. I give a ton of credit to the guys who can just go out and grind through these races on their own, grind through it and just have themselves and their own thoughts to kind of go through and battle these races. But I really enjoy sharing those experiences with a friend and sharing the suffering when you go through it with someone else. And so just kind of knew that, had that expectation going into the race. So it kind of, I think, made the unofficial decision that it would really depend how late in the race, if there were to be an issue, how late in the race it was would determine if I were to continue on my own. And especially since it was midway through, I mean, early on in the third loop, still had most of the overnight portion to go, and then the entire fourth loop. And again, the finish line just wouldn't have been the same without finishing with Todd. So I knew it was a very easy decision to make. I don't feel bad about it at all. I've told everyone after the race that it feels like I answered all of the unanswered questions I had from last year. I finished last year's race just feeling so defeated because of the confidence we went into that race with and how defeated and decimated our moral state was and physically we were at the end of just the second loop. Just felt like I hadn't trained properly, I hadn't planned properly, just felt like I went into that race so underprepared. This race went in much more humbly, went in with much different expectations, and also went in with a lot more planning. And so what I was most excited about and what I consider like the biggest victory for myself for this race was just how well all of the planning fell into place. Even though I didn't get in all of the miles that I went or that I wanted to necessarily, and even though I transitioned from like intense marathon training to just a few weeks of prep for the ultra marathon, really put a lot of thought into the nutrition, the hydration, the pacing, etc. And that all went off without a hitch. And as I mentioned, when we made the decision to drop, I was still in pretty good running shape. I was still able to run the downhills, like I said, still power climbing, power hiking through those uphills, and didn't feel, obviously like felt the fatigue, but it wasn't defeating me. Each climb wasn't defeating me the way that it was at the end of the second loop in last year's race. So felt just incredible about that. Of course, everyone's question was, do I think I could have finished or I would have finished if I kept going? And I just don't think that's even worth having the conversation about, only because we're 65 miles in. There's still 35 miles left in that race. Sure, I was feeling good at that point, but 35 miles is a long way and a lot could have gone wrong. I obviously was in shape to keep going. I think I probably would have at least made it through the third loop. But again, just have no idea what I could have expected over the last 35 miles of the race, especially going through those on my own. So just very excited with how the race went, how well everything fell into place, and excited that we can say that we ran as far as we ever did. So sure, again, like I said, would have loved if Todd and I could have gotten that finish line, gotten that belt buckle, but I think we had the experience that we needed after last year's race, and I'm just so excited with how things went, and also allowed us to just fully enjoy Sunday. We weren't totally beaten down, we weren't totally destroyed, so just got to hang out back at camp, hung out a lot with Dan and his family as well, and just had a great time celebrating the race, celebrating the experience, and kind of going through all of those details that you tend to do once you cross the unofficial, your own finish line, wherever that may be on the course. So that's where we're at, and those are my tales from the Mohican 100 miler this year, or Mohican 65 miler for Todd and myself. Really just can't overstate how much we enjoyed this race and how much better it went as compared to last year's course. Had a lot of fun. And then of course the question is, what comes next? I mentioned after last year's race, I forget if I talked about that, but when we dropped out of last year's race, I had told Todd when we were making the decision to drop, like, I didn't expect myself ever to sign up for another 100 miler. I registered last year just for the experience with no intention of doing another one. Wanted to kind of go in. If I finished it, great. If I didn't, I learned about the race. That was great too, but it was just kind of a one-time deal. And then when we went on Sunday morning and watched all of our friends finishing the race and seeing everyone kind of going through those dark spots, knowing how hard it had been for them, seeing the celebration and elation when they crossed the finish line, I think that was the ultimate motivator that pulled us back. And again, no regrets about signing up for this race at all, but I've mentioned in several videos throughout this year, throughout the end of last year, that I am really feeling myself being pulled back to road racing, especially back to marathons. That is a distance and a race that I really want to try to hone in on. And I know to do that, I've got to focus a lot more physical training and mental training on that race, because it is certainly a beast. That's not to say that I will never come back to trail races or even to 100 milers. We talked a lot over the weekend at Mohican that we would love to do like some shorter ultra marathons, would love some trail marathons, 50Ks, maybe even a 50 miler or 100K every now and then. Again, don't want to go too crazy because I know those also demand a lot of training, a lot of preparation, but really do enjoy. There's just nothing like the camaraderie of trail races and ultra marathons. They are so vastly different in the community, I think, as opposed to road races. Road races, at least in my perspective, are so much more about like the individual effort, the individual fight. You have your goal, you are running to PR, that is it. Whereas trail races, it's a lot more about just enjoying the experience, especially for casual trail running, enjoying the experience, the folks that you meet out on the trail, the crews and the aid stations that are out there supporting you. Like, it is, the whole race is just so much more of a community. Love that experience and absolutely will go back. But I think for big major training goals, going back to road races, still trying to find a fall marathon to train for, probably something later in the fall, but that's where my focus is going to start to shift as we recover from this Mohican 100 miler, as my foot heals from whatever this injury is, just starting to get those legs back in shape, reestablishing that base, and hopefully building in some more strength and speed dedicated work to hopefully continue to improve that marathon PR. That is the main goal that I want to shift my focus towards. So, had so much fun at the Mohican 100 miler, loved the race. We'll probably go back at some point, not necessarily for the 100 miler, maybe for a shorter different distance, or maybe even to pace folks, because I do love that race, but ready to figure out what my fall marathon is gonna be, commit to that goal, and start building out that months-long training plan that I'm gonna commit to over the next several weeks. So really excited about that. A lot of uncertainty on the horizon, but I think that can be exciting as well, just trying to figure out what comes next. But I hope you enjoyed this. A very long, deep dive into the Mohican 100 miler. It certainly was an incredible race. If you are considering getting into ultra marathons or trying your first 100 miler, I would encourage you to do it as soon as possible. The experience that you get from every race, even a DNF, even your first 100 miler, whatever it might be, just the experience that you get every new race, especially in the beginning, you learn so much, and you can grow so much in trail running and ultra marathon running so early on, and just have so much fun at all of these races, on all of these courses, and really explore some incredible places. So highly encourage you to take advantage of it. Dive in if you are interested. I know I did and have never looked back. It's been a great experience, and looking forward to whatever the next adventure may be. So thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I hope once again you'll give the video a thumbs up, click that subscribe button if you haven't already, to see the future content coming out as we shift our focus to that marathon training. But until then, I'll keep working on editing the footage from the Mohican 100 miler and hopefully get that out to y'all shortly. Cheers.